unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan and Maitreesh. As India heads to the polls, a new chapter is being written in a very old debate about poverty and inequality in the country. This debate has been stirred up by the release of new data from a government-sponsored consumption survey, which some have argued shows a massive decline in poverty. Others believe that this data are not so unequivocal, highlighting a widening gap between the top income earners and ordinary Indians. To help us understand this debate and how to interpret this data, I'm joined on the show today by Maitreesh Ghatak. Maitreesh is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics, where he has been the director of the Development Economics Group at the research center STICERD since 2005. He is a widely respected voice on India's economic development, has been especially focused in recent years on questions of growth, poverty, and inequality. I am pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Maitreesh, it's so nice to have you on.
I'm delighted to be having this conversation with you, Milan.
So I want to begin by asking you a kind of a macro question about the health of the Indian economy. As today, as we're recording, April 19th, the country kicks off the 2024 general elections. The government and the ruling party have gone to the polls, touting the fact that India is the fastest growing major economy in the world, and that under its watch, over the past 10 years, it has vastly expanded India's welfare net. The opposition, if you listen to what they have to say, argue that the bulk of the gains of the past 10 years have accrued to the haves at the expense of the have-nots. As an academic economist who has studied India closely for many years now, what's your objective assessment, again, at the kind of macro level, of where the Indian economy stands circa 2024?
I would say that if you look at the big picture in terms of the macro indices that economists look at before going into more heterogeneous type issues about sectors, about how different groups are doing, if you take a bird's eye view of the economy, then clearly the growth story is exaggerated as it put out by the kind of, if you can say, the official line. And there are several reasons for it. I mean, it's true that India's growth rate, at least in the last 2 years, have been pretty reasonable, despite various revisions and things. I think it's sort of, the bounce back from the pandemic has been robust. But I did some calculations, and I'm sure others have looked at it too. If you adjust by the kind of size of the economy, and if you adjust by the fact that how much India's GDP contracted during the pandemic, that does take away some of the effects of the bounce back. It's not to, say that there's no extra bounce back, but for those 8%, those kinds of numbers that are touted, if you really look at what was the GDP level at 2019, before the pandemic, and then if you compare that with 2021, 22, ignoring the 2020 dip, I think that India's performance has been decent if you look at the last 2 years, and certainly some positive directions can be seen. But to claim that India is the fastest growing economy in the whole world among the major economies, I would say that has to be taken with a fair bit of salt. Looking at some of the 5-yearly and 10-yearly growth rates after the liberalization period, right? So leaving aside the pandemic and the bounce back point that I meant, like you have to adjust for that. And it's actually pretty striking that if you look at, say, 5-yearly growth rates, for the last 2 5-year periods, so if you either take the 2015 to 2020 or you parse it in different ways, there was a growth slowdown that was happening already. And the second point, of course, is the GDP measurement controversy that has to be flagged here. And several people have written on it. And I think, to be fair, whatever the critiques are, it wouldn't necessarily affect the growth rates permanently because it will be a scale factor. So therefore, when one does, say, a 10-year growth calculation, then there might be a slight inflation going in because of some of the issues that have gone into calculating real versus nominal and the various issues dealing with the informal sector, etc.
I want to kind of ask you a little bit about what's going on the consumption story, because that is in some sense the lead-in to the broader conversation on poverty and inequality. There was a recent opinion piece in Mint by the data journalist Pramith Bhattacharya, who writes the following, that elections in India seem to be incomplete these days without the background noise of a statistical controversy. And what he's referring to there is that in 2019, as many of our listeners will recall, ahead of the 2019 general elections, the government suppressed a highly inconvenient employment report and junked an unflattering consumption survey. This time around, the government has partially released a slightly more optimistic consumption survey, which is kind of stirring up this new controversy. Let's just talk about the data that's now in the public domain from this most recent consumption survey. What do the official data tell us, and what is quote unquote partial about this partial release?
So, yeah, I think that unfortunately, whatever is the state of the real economy, one of the areas where India's performance in the last decade has been really, really disappointing is the data-related controversy. And a lot of this is, you could say, was avoidable. I think if we have had debates about poverty, debates about inequality, who can forget liberalization and, the flood of neoliberalism sinking India, So there were robust debates that was going on, and some people argued that poverty hasn't declined that much or even has increased. Others like Angus Deaton and Jean Drèze and many others push back. So debates are not new to the Indian kind of either consumption surveys or more broadly. But just to bullet point the issues that have been kind of disappointing. First of all, the 2011-12 National NSO Consumer Expenditure Survey was the last survey and still is the last detailed survey that's out there in the public domain. After that, there was a controversy around the 2017-18 survey, which never got published because of data quality issues. But a leaked version was circulated, and some people, like very, very reputable economists like S. Subramaniam, looked at those numbers and showed actually increase in poverty as well as decrease in average consumption levels. It may well have been due to demonetization and some of the shocks. So it's one thing to talk about what's happening in long term, but a lot of these things are subject to fluctuation. So I'm willing to be agnostic on the fact that poverty was declining, but for a bunch of reasons, it may have been looking particularly bad that year. So that is entirely possible. And then what we have is, I think it was February 28th, when the new fact sheet published by the NSO on the basis of the new NSO Consumer Expenditure Survey that has come out. I have written a sort of detailed piece on it, so I have read it very carefully. And again, I think while it suggests some positive developments in terms of how much average consumption levels have shifted and what has happened to poverty, because of the timing of its publication and what it reveals and what it conceals, it is the classic thing. I have a feeling if they put everything out there, maybe it's not ready. I'm willing to, grant them that benefit of the doubt. Some of us would have been much more sympathetic to, and really try to understand what's going on. Whereas here, there's always information always has two roles. One is the real role of communication, understanding, and the other is signaling and advertising. So I think in the way some of the stuff has played out in the last 10 years, and also interestingly, in the same year that the NSO report was not published on the Consumer Expenditure Survey, the next year, the ADIS report was published with no problem, all the details, which is the All India Debt and Investment Survey, which actually suggested a marginal decrease in inequality. So again, you always worry about the classic sort of the student who reports to the parents only for papers where the grades look good. And when you asked about, but what about math? The guy says, oh, there were problems in the school, some problems with the reporting and the testing, it's going to be reviewed. So that's my take on it. So I think Pramit is exactly right. And I have a feeling that not everything that has happened in the last 10 years has been negative. So there are clearly some positive things, including the expansion of the welfare net that we have noted in our, my last piece with Rishabh Kumar in the India Forum. I think that if it was if a more trusting regime in terms of sharing data and not thinking everybody who's going to look at them is going to be have some kind of a hatchet job about to be done in terms of critiquing the government, I think we would have had a much better understanding of what's going on. And like I said, that I don't think all the developments are negative. I'm very happy to talk about some of the problems and the issues, but not all developments are negative. So that's my general take on this, that there's always this slight unease about what is revealed and what we get to see out of that.
So, Maitreesh, this is a very important point, and I just want to pause on this for a second because my understanding of the situation is as follows, and then I want you to correct me. The first is there are questions about the timing because, of course, this came out on the eve of the elections without the complete data revealed. So there are limits to what's in the public domain, and so therefore the real issue is the absence of what economists refer to as unit level data that then allows them to really look at the data at a very granular level to look for patterns, for heterogeneous effects, for all kinds of nuances which may not show up in a fact sheet that is produced by the government, which kind of obviously all governments would be the same. Want to put a shine on whatever the numbers are. Is that essentially the what's going on here? That economists like yourself who are trying to analytically explore the Indian economy don't actually have the raw data to do so?
Absolutely, and in fact, you put it exactly correctly, but to the kind of layperson who may not even fully understand what unit level data and all the technical details are, this is the basic problem. What the government has released is basically you have the whole sample and then you rank them in terms of expenditure classes, 0 to 5%, 5 to 10%, 10 to 20%. That's how you group them. It's like students in a school. You're ranking them in terms of, in this case, it's consumer expenditure. And what this fact sheet reveals is what their average consumption levels are at current prices. And then kind of they do various variations, urban, rural, etc., right? Now, I'll tell you what it put people like us who are interested in poverty, the quandary we were put in. All we have is 2011-12 and Tendulkar and Rangarajan lines. And
those are definitions of particular poverty lines.
I'm sorry,
relating to Rangarajan and Tendulkar. No, that's okay. This is we have to get into some of these nitty gritty here.
Exactly. So just imagine that in 2011 prices, what would be the amount of money that you would need to buy a bundle of goods that would qualify you to be at the poverty line or above it, right? So that's Tendulkar's is more conservative one, and then Rangarajan's is more liberal one. But it's something like in the 30s, rupees 30s per person per day in rural areas, in the 40s, per person per day in urban areas. So then what people like researchers like us have to do is take that number, whatever that was, then multiply that by the consumer price index, inflation rate over the next 10 years to come up with what it would have been in 2022, 2023. No other, what else can you do? And then you put this in terms of this distribution, the table that the fact sheet document puts out, and we see that, hey, there has to be a dramatic decrease in poverty. Yeah. Now, there are several problems with that. And again, I want to really emphasize here that, all of us have political, ideological biases as to what causes poverty, what's the best solution. But uh, I would really, for the work that I've done on the Indian economy and various co-authors I work with, I'm really passionate with the view that, like in medicine, you need to get the diagnosis right. After that, let there be a robust debate about, whether this way, that way, and that's fine. But whether it's the left-right debate about, just denying, whether liberalization led to reduction in poverty, that's not a debate we should have been having. Similarly, right now, we should really have a clear picture of what's happening to poverty, and then, But coming to this, there are three problems with this, what we get to see, and that puts us in this state of ambiguity, which greater data availability can only resolve. Otherwise, we can only have, our biases can take us one way or the other. The first one is the fact that we do not have the value of the public distribution system or the welfare payments in the earlier surveys. And this fact sheet does present numbers, which takes into account how much of these welfare, amounts that the poor are getting. But it's given in a way that's very unclear. I'll give you an example. Even the top decile, these would be presumably the urban, not poor, right? Even they are getting some of these welfare benefits. Now, clearly, it makes you a bit skeptical that if I compare what the technical term is with or without imputation, and imputation is the value of the various welfare benefits, primarily rations. So the problem is the 2011-12 numbers did not take that into account. So therefore, that's the first problem of comparability. What's the second problem of comparability? Second problem of comparability is 2011-12 had a certain consumer expenditure patterns. Some of these items may not be even relevant today. All the, use of mobile phones and some of the digital stuff that has happened in the next 10 years wasn't so relevant there. And then whether it's Uber or various kinds of aspects. So what I'm saying is, therefore, if you compare the inflation rate and, just allow for general inflation that has happened over the last decade, that is missing out as to what the emerging composition of food would be. If earlier 50% of your budget went on food and now it's less than that, just applying the general inflation, you could be overshooting or undershooting. So this is where I have to be agnostic. So maybe poverty has gone down even more than some of these calculations are suggesting, but we have no way of knowing without the granular information that you said at the very beginning. That's really the meaning of the unit level data, because basically we need to know what the composition of consumption of various groups are. And among the poor, what would be the monetary amount that would be needed to buy them a basket that is comparable to 2011-12? And then we would be able to make a comparison. So this is what we are not able to do. All we are able to do is, roughly speaking, whatever you're consuming, applying general inflation. So whatever you're earning back in 2011, Milan, you or me, we just apply the economy-wide average inflation rate and say, okay, this is what that would be your, if you got this, earning this currently, that would be protecting your real income. But we all know that is problematic for these reasons. So I would say, because of these reasons, we do not have a clear picture about what is happening to extreme poverty. Having said that, so the first 2 points were kind of critical. The third one, I've already mentioned it, and I want to come back to it. The welfare, the government expenditure on some of the welfare schemes, especially the public distribution system, the Awas Yojana, certain, drinking water, this has gone up since the pandemic, right? And even after the pandemic, when some of the other policies have been relaxed, the expenditure hasn't gone down on these. So it is well possible that because of this, the poor are now able to spend more money on other things. And that could be a positive reason as to what we are observing out of this consumer expenditure survey.
That's very helpful. Thank you for walking us through that, because I think one has to sort of get into the weeds to understand what's really happening underneath the hood. Taking into consideration everything you've just said, I want to ask you about a piece that was published by Brookings by the economist Surjit Balla and his co-author Karan Basan, and we'll link to that in the show notes, in which they said, based on these consumption numbers, we can conclude now that India has completely eliminated extreme poverty, which they define as $1.90 a day in purchasing power parity terms. But they go on to say something else, which is not only has poverty declined significantly, income inequality has also improved. So I want to hear your interpretation of the data. But before we get to that, I want to ask you a little bit about process. Given all the methodological issues involved, many people have said, doing an analysis like this is kind of like comparing apples and oranges here. How safely can we make kind of over time longitudinal comparisons like this?
In the absence of the kind of granular data, everything is a leap of faith. Now, essentially, I don't want to, again, as an academic, one has a tendency to go on in kind of, long discussions on something. So I'm aware of that bias. So let me summarize, again, Surjit and I, we have had ongoing robust discussions, and I'm on his mailing list. And whenever we meet, we discuss cricket and other things. But I have to say that Surjit has announced the elimination of extreme poverty, well before these numbers came out. And, so it's like, jeetega to jeetega, India jeetega. So well before the match results are out, I appreciate somebody having that kind of enthusiasm about or optimistic outlook that extreme poverty has been eliminated. And look, none of us, and I think, these days, and especially with the election season, maybe non-partisan views are not very common, or people view it with skepticism. But I genuinely think for things about public health and safety and poverty, there should not be any partisan discussion. Any regime that does an improvement in terms of the living conditions of the very poor, one should not be questioning that. If that has happened, one should acknowledge it. But now let me come to the specific questions you brought up. See, the problem with the Surjit, Karan, and I think in one of the earlier papers before this round of discussions was the Arvind Virwani. So they had a IMF working paper that came out, I think, in 2022, and then there was the World Bank one. See, the problem was because the government was not releasing the data, people were relying on other data sets. So what Surjit et al. Did was they took the national income accounts and the consumption growth that you project out of that, applied that to the 2011-12 NSS survey. I can tell you that that's not something that is treated as kosher in any serious discussion. And indeed, therefore, because of several problems. So these are very different kinds of data collection procedures. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but, that's that. Then what we have is the discussion based on the current sort of release about the elimination of extreme poverty. So I think that, again, given the issues I mentioned, that we do not have a new poverty line, because it's a bit like, look, again, let's go back to things that the listener to a program like this could relate to, as opposed to trying to project ourselves in the lives of the extreme poor. Is that, look, suppose our salary back in 2011-12 and the consumption basket that we had then, we are just trying to protect it and ask that what would the amount of money we would need in 2022-3 to have it. And clearly, you would need the details about the prices of different goods and stuff to come up with a new estimate. That hasn't happened. all you're doing is taking your consumer patterns there. Maybe you were consuming you were not using many of the digital services. Maybe your Amazon or Netflix subscriptions were absent, whatever it was. So, and you were doing other things. So therefore, it's a huge leap of faith to just apply mechanically the general inflation rate to that thing. Just imagine if anybody who would be credulous enough to accept this argument, that suppose this is how you're going to have to renegotiate your salary. Would you feel confident? Just use the average inflation, what you were consuming in 2011-12. You're going to say, wait a second, because a lot of the consumer expenditure patterns have changed, and whether it's education, health, whatever, and that's reasonable. That's so therefore, coming back to it, I think this announcement of the elimination of extreme poverty is premature. It is very possible that, because of the enhanced welfare entitlements and things, that the current, even in the last 10 years, some positive changes have happened. But before you announce that the patient is fit and can go for a marathon run, one should be very careful here, because we are dealing with extreme poverty, and one shouldn't be cavalier in announcing something that is. Now, I also want to point out that the World Bank researchers, Sutito Sena Roy van der Weide, they have done a very interesting and methodologically solid way to infer poverty without waiting for Godot or the NSO to reveal the whole details of this survey, is to essentially take, in the case of the Sena-Roy and van der Weide, the CPHS data set of CMI that from 2014 on has published detailed household expenditure stuff.
Right, and I should just point out to our listeners, this is data collected by a private company from a large number of households on a quarterly basis, and has been increasingly relied upon by researchers in the absence of counterpart data from the government.
That's exactly right. So what they showed based on this was around the time of the pandemic, when the NSO Consumer Expenditure Survey was supposed to come out, extreme poverty has gone down to about 10%. Whereas, Bhalla et al. Was using the national income method, announcing it was 2 or 3% or something like that, or 4%. So the trouble with that data set, though, is exactly for some of the reasons you outlined. I think there are credible arguments that it doesn't capture the extreme poor well in its sample. And I think they have been reasonably transparent and open in these discussions, and their ongoing efforts to try to. So this is not to knock a kind of valuable data resource, and I'm sure that there'll be more progress on that count. But what Rishabh, Kumar, and I did, and this has been really the bulk of the work we did in the last 2 years on this subject, and what we did was we used the PLFS survey, which has been coming out, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, which is an annual survey that has started coming out from 2017-18. And exactly using similar methods as the World Bank guys, except for we're using an official survey with a much better sample frame that would not be subject to these critiques. Our estimate suggests, interestingly, using this indirect method, that at the time of the post-demonetization 2017-18, poverty had not declined at all since 2011-12, which is in line with the leaked report that did not, that suggested the same. But before people think that this is all naysaying and critical, we ran the same thing and did it for 2022-23. And our numbers are only slightly higher than what the new consumer expenditure survey numbers are. So we are showing something like 8% when the, based on the, the survey, the fact sheet that has come out, it's around 5%.
This is 5% of households in poverty.
Exactly, yeah. In extreme poverty, using the line you said. So the PLFS data, I think these are all, I hope that going forward, this would all be viewed as resources for cross-checking, because we want the NSO survey to come out. But because all these other surveys are going on, it's the classic thing that you can always use this to cross-check and make sure that some of the trends you find pass the smell test. So therefore, this goes back to my skepticism about the announcement of extreme poverty being eliminated. I would say that I have the same eagerness as Balla and Basin to see that happen, but I would say more circumspection is needed before victory lap is done. I think we should be more circumspect.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So you mentioned several times your work with your co-author Rishabh Kumar. We will link to a recent essay that you have in the India Forum, which was quite revealing in terms of recent trends in poverty. And I want to ask you just one clarification on what you've said, which is, to sum up, you too find, using a slightly different set of methods, a pretty impressive decline in poverty, although extreme poverty is still hovering around the 8% level or so. Just if we can isolate a bit what's happened, say, over the past 10 years, how does the rate of decline in poverty compare to, say, the previous 10 years? Do we have a sense of the kind of over time trend?
No, we actually, for this particular piece, we calculated what is called the growth elasticity of poverty, which again, it's nerd speak. So let me spell it out a bit. So people basically, you can see that, say, over a decadal period, what was the growth rate of, say, GDP per capita? And we can also calculate what was the rate of decline of extreme poverty. And if you divide one by the other, you could get a rough measure of how much of the growth is actually helping reducing poverty.
Right. I mean, it's in a really simplistic way, it's kind of how much bang for your buck did you get, right?
Absolutely right. Now, here, if I look at the various rounds going up to the liberalization period and before that, if you look at the NSO consumer survey expenditure rounds, so that the decades are not 91 to 2001, not those rounded ones, but 83 to 93, 93 to 2004, because these are, by the when this NSO survey reports have come out. The growth rate has been highest between 2004 and 2012. So if you take 83 to 93, 93 to 2004, 2004 to 2012, and then 2012 to 2022, the growth rate was highest in the 2004 to 2012 period. The second highest is the last one, 2012 to 2022, narrowly beating out 93 to 2004. Okay, so sorry to put in a lot of numbers here, but if I look at poverty decline, which was your specific question, in terms of if we calculate the growth elasticity, it was minus 3.4 in the previous period, 2004 to 2012. Okay, so if you look at the actual decline and how much it declined, it was 40.6% people living below extreme poverty in 2004, and that went down to 23% in 2012, right? So that's roughly a 17 percentage point drop. Yeah. Whereas if you take the 2022 numbers and if you use the standard inflation inflating factor compared to the 2011 poverty line, it's around 5%. Okay, so that's again about 18% drop since 2012, right? But if you, given the fact that growth has been slower in the last decade, we have a poverty elasticity, the growth elasticity of poverty that is highest in the last decade compared to the previous one. So short and pithy, answer to your question, in terms of absolute drop in poverty, extreme people below the extreme poverty threshold, the percentage point drops are comparable between 2004 and 2012 and 2012 and 2022. But given the growth performance has been mediocre in the last decade, therefore, this poverty decline, record looks more impressive than in the previous one.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. One of the things you point out in your essay with Rishabh on the question of the poverty decline is that India is a unique outlier, right? And other economists have written about this as well, which is as economies transition from low to middle income status, they also typically become much less agrarian. And what's interesting in the Indian case is agriculture makes up a decreasing share of GDP, to be sure, but the agricultural share of labor has not changed as much as we might think. How then has India kind of bucked the global trend, right? That they've been able to achieve such a significant poverty decline when you still have, say, 40%, just to pick a ballpark figure, of people who are employed in the agrarian sector.
No, I think that is really, if we leave aside India's political debates and what's happened in the last 10 years compared to the previous, if you leave that aside, if you are an international observer who's concerned about poverty, and say a World Bank economist or somebody else, I think India, to the extent the trends that this fact sheet reveals are backed up to some degree when the detailed survey results come out. I'm sure there'll be controversy and some range in which people will debate, whether there'll be a lower bound and upper bound. But to the extent poverty has declined, extreme poverty, it will be considered in the global discussion as the Indian exceptionalism, and people will have to wrap their head around it. And exactly for the reason that you pointed out, and this is something Rishabh and I said, because, if you look at the history of developed countries, Simon Kuznets, Leontief, others who have studied this in long-term processes and so on, there's a very robust stylized fact. And, I can put it in somewhat academic terms, but everybody knows it. As economies develop, people move from low productivity to high productivity sectors. Share of agriculture shrinks in GDP, as well as, importance of the workforce that's employed there. In India, in the last 10 years, the share of agriculture in GDP has stayed basically constant. Let me correct myself. It's not just the last 10 years. Around 2005 onwards, if you look at it, it's basically 16% of GDP. Agriculture occupies that. The percentage of workforce employed in agriculture has fallen a bit, but all this poses the puzzle that the poverty decline is not in line in experience with India's earlier performance, as well as China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia. You pick the country, you look at their, structural transformation, what's happening to poverty. So that's a puzzle. And just to repeat what I said a bit earlier, the only valid way in which I can think that this could have, happened, and it's not a statistical artifact because of the inflation, correction not being done, properly and stuff, is the enhanced entitlement programs. The fact that they were jacked up during the pandemic, and Rishabh and I'm calling it accidental welfarism, because normally you would expect a left-wing regime which would be doing all of this. And earlier we heard statements like, all these schemes are signs of failure of the earlier, economic eras. But interestingly, it shows that may have been a positive factor. But it also shows, I would say, somewhat maybe, it makes us ponder as to the policy priorities. If it was so easy, why didn't we do it before? If really this, the fact that the pandemic kind of forced the government's hands, that, people were really at a subsistence risk, and this could be done, and poverty did go down. It's a question for the current government as well as the previous one. Why couldn't more be done? Because after all, look, extreme poverty is $2 per person per day in purchasing power. If you really have to have your priorities right, it is not exactly like climbing Mount Everest. It's something, as opposed to creating, better health, better education, all of that, that's harder. But this is not so hard. But anyway, that would be my answer.
Well, just a note that it's very interesting, right? That one of the things this government has done is to extend for a longer period of time the free rations that the government distributes to about 800 million people. And in the BJP's manifesto, it pledges to keep that going for another 5 years, right? So clearly, this kind of welfarism seems like it's here to stay. I want to ask you a little bit now about the inequality question, right? Because this is, again, something else that we're all eagerly debating, and you have been a key protagonist in this debate. We leave aside the questions of poverty for a moment. Let's talk a little bit about the distribution. Most people seem to cite data which comes from something called the World Inequality Report. It's pretty well known globally. It suggests that wealth inequality in India has increased over the past few decades. If you look at other data, as you and your co-authors have done, which comes from within India, survey data from the All India Debt and Investment Survey, it points to actually a reduction in wealth inequality in recent years. You have cautioned us to take these survey numbers with a pinch of salt. And I wonder if you could just help us understand, what the inequality picture kind of looks like if we're thinking about, the last 10 years or so.
No, it's a great question, and in some ways it nests some of the discussions we're having about growth and poverty, because these are not, independent, right? Growth is a process that different segments of society experience, and some benefit more from it, some less, and that's where poverty and other inequality comes up. So I would say that, look, inequality is a very charged topic, and anytime you even utter the term, there's one thing is just ideological. The left doesn't like inequality. The right thinks, oh, come on, Sachin Tendulkar, earns lots of money, or Shah Rukh Khan, hard work, talent.
And more power to them, right?
Exactly. What's your problem? Is it like envy that you're not, And then I think the more serious discussion is really about equality of opportunity, that it's not a matter of resenting somebody, being rewarded for hard work or enterprise. It's more like, are we losing out the future entrepreneurs, future scientists, future innovators, future, and that I think is a very serious concern, that no serious thinker on this, whether on the economic right or economic left, would disagree. And then there's the question about the pragmatic question that, look, you may not like inequality for ideological reasons. You may even believe that the fact that equality of opportunity is what's important, and it excludes people who are talented but didn't have the privileges, and it promotes people who are not particularly talented but they were privileged, whether it's the Nepo kids phenomena at large, right? But what can you do about it, short of some kind of a radical redistribution program, which I don't think even the left parties have on their manifesto these days? So what can you really do about it, right? So then you have either income tax or wealth tax or corporation tax or various kinds of regulations in place, right? So that's where the debate is. So now coming to the data questions, I think Piketty and his co-authors and they have created a really impressive database. And I think that taking pot shots at that is not helpful. I myself have criticized it in the piece that you pointed out in the India Forum a couple of years ago with two of my students. And essentially, because of the data gaps, I'll give you just one example, income tax data, because, there is no, all we have, if you're really trying to think about how do I come up with an income distribution statistics for India, all we have are the consumer expenditure surveys, income tax data, right? That's all we have, right? So and we all know that what percentage of the population files for income tax, what percentage pays for it, right? Similarly, consumer expenditure surveys have not really been updated since 2011. So a lot of assumptions are made and distributions are fitted. I'm trying to keep the nerd speak at a minimum, but essentially it's like, suppose you know what Soviet Union's growth rate was in the 1940s, and then you know what it was in the 60s. What are you going to do for the 50s, right? You're going to fit a line, you're going to fit a curve, you're going to do one thing or the other. So what Piketty et al. Do is therefore, for the gaps in the income tax, for example, after 2000, there was a gap after which 2011 onwards we have the income tax figures. So they look at the segment of people who pay income tax and then look at that distribution and extrapolate that to people who don't pay that, right? Now, to a non-economist, all this would seem like hocus pocus, and they are entitled to their skepticism, right? But to an economist, it's like, what else are you going to do? You make different assumptions, right? For example, as they note in the recent paper, that if you assume the rich and the poor evade income tax at the same rate, you get something. But if you think the rich are better at evading income tax,
Right.
you get something else, right? So
Right.
you can make different assumptions. So coming back to the specific question about inequality, I think the ADIS survey did show a deceleration of inequality, actually a reduction in inequality over the last 7-8 years since the last round. And that was in contrast with what Piketty et al. Were doing, right? And my take on that contradiction is as follows: that first of all, reduction of inequality is not always a good thing. And the reason is, suppose you have roads that are fast. So the expensive cars, the sports cars will go at a fast rate. The Maruti 800s will go at a slow rate, right? And so inequality may go up, but all the cars are moving. You make the road terrible. As a result, the sports car are not going very fast, and the Maruti 800 is also going slow, and inequality therefore would go down if you take the analogy of where the cars are to income. So that's one thing. And the other, I think the more serious thing is, when was the last time anybody in your social network got covered by ADIS or the NSO? I think it's very unlikely. So therefore, there is a top coding problem, as statisticians put it. So the people who are included even in the most affluent parts of these surveys are really missing out the rich and the super rich. So therefore, what's happening there may not be a true reflection of what's happening to the affluent 5% or 1%.
I mean, it's kind of the inverse of the problem we spoke about earlier, which is one of the criticisms of private survey like CMIE, but there are others, is that it's very hard to capture the poorest. Conversely, it's also very hard to capture the richest, right?
That's a very nicely put duality. Exactly right. It's for the same reason. You're missing the very bottom when you're looking at a service like the CPHS. And then you're missing out the very rich. You read about the newspaper about the lifestyle of the rich and famous, but that's not what the survey boring guys who knock at your door and ask questions. That's not what they're capturing.
You mentioned that this reduction in inequality may not be such a good thing, counterintuitively. I just want to quote something that you and your co-authors wrote and maybe just ask you very quickly to expand on that. You say, if the process of growth in an unequal and labor surplus economy leads to increasing inequality, a slowdown of overall growth can lead to a reduction in inequality, right? By which you seem to be saying, well, if we're experiencing a growth slowdown, maybe that's why we're seeing a reduction in inequality, and that ain't such a great thing either.
That's exactly right, and that was the analogy I was trying to give with the sports car and the Maruti 800. When the roads are fast, those guys, everybody is going faster, but the sports are accelerating, right? So you would say, oh my God, inequality has gone up. When the roads are not so great, or they're becoming congested or not so good quality, the other thing, and I think there's an irony here, because I think the left traditionally focused on the inequality of outcomes and bemoaned the rise of inequality that has happened liberalization. And, I'm sympathetic to that for a number of reasons. But it's also, I think, validates the basic point of the economic right there, that if you have growth opportunities, it's like if the schools improve a lot, whose kids will benefit more? I mean, it would be for people who are already high human capital.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fact of life. It isn't fair. We want a system where this doesn't happen. And I think this is exactly the analogy, that the rich are better able to take opportunities. So if you generally have better infrastructure, better overall economic environment in terms of trade and other things, they will do better than the others.
So let me just bring this conversation to a close, Maitreesh, by asking you about one final issue, which in a sense has been looming in the background of this entire conversation, right? One of the takeaways for me, anyway, of reading your research is that many of these debates that we're having are severely complicated, maybe even you could say inhibited by the fact that India exhibits so many significant data gaps. And I'm curious about how you think about the significance of two issues, right? Which is you have questions of data availability on the one hand, but we also have some mounting questions around data reliability. And just as a final question, are we suffering from deficiencies on both? And to what extent is the problem getting worse or getting better?
No, that's a great question. I think one of the things that before I get into the substance of your question, I think one of the things that as an Indian who stepped into the field of development economics, doing my PhD in the US and then, of course, spending some part of my time there as well as in the UK, it's like, how come so many Indians do development economics? How come every other paper in development economics is about India? And you could say that that was a reflection of the fact that India was a country where essentially a certain intellectual culture was, despite our low per capita income, was always there. And that shows up in, people who grew up in India like yourself or me. We have we cannot ignore poverty. You cannot ignore problems of deprivation. It's all around us. So it's not surprising for Indians to be interested in that. And also, compared to some other countries, which I don't necessarily need to name here, surveys and other things were more open. You can go to India, do a survey, so therefore that way, data collection, data availability. And again, the more I reflect on the debates, you think about pioneers like Mahalanobis, and whatever valid academic criticism these are titans in not just India for global scale. I don't know if if he would qualify for the Nobel Prize for anything, because clearly he was a statistician, even though he started off as a physicist. But he's the kind of guy who really set up all this infrastructure. So, and there are discussions in American economists like Irving Fisher and others who are saying that India is doing this, so we should be modifying, this, right? What India thinks today, the world thinks tomorrow. Okay, so that was then. So now we have a question both of the availability of data, the scarcity, and all of us are restricted a bit to extrapolating out of outdated data, 2011, 12, NSO being an example, right? And then the question of the data reliability as to, what you see, is that completely reliable? I would say that in terms of what I've seen to be out there, whether it's the 80s, 2018-19 survey or things that have come, I still have enough faith in the overall data administration in terms of the way the surveys are carried out. So therefore, even with the current NSO, my instincts are sympathetic because there's a whole infrastructure, there are trained people that go out, there's a certain system of cross checks and so on. My worry and my criticism is really about, data in the end is an input. It's a raw material, what you do out of it. Kind of making it so closely to political campaign, and everything that, anything that goes up is a credit to the current government. Anything that goes down has to be some nefarious conspiracy, which has to be either, that is the problem. That I think is the true problem. It's not so much, of course, and the fact that some of the data series were not published, it didn't happen for accidental reasons like rainfall or flood or earthquakes. It happened because of deliberate government decisions, right? And like I said about the student who comes back home and somehow refuses to share the math, test marks, you always worry, why wouldn't you tell me how much you got in math, right? And when you're showing that for creative writing, I did this, and for singing, I'm like the world's best, what about the math marks? I heard this, okay, Niti Aayog has said this about the multidimensional poverty index and all good. Give me the time series. If they had time series going back to 40 years, we would all embrace it and say, oh, this has gone up and gone down.
My guest on the show this week is the economist Maitreesh Ghatak. He is professor of economics at the LSE. He is a prolific author and observer. We will link to several of his pieces in the show notes, including a series of, I think, really informative data-driven takes published in the India Forum, most recently with Rishabh Kumar on poverty, but prior to that on India's job creation record, on trends in economic inequality, and on sustainable growth. Maitreesh, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Milan. It's been a genuine pleasure chatting with you.
Grantamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grantamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.